At first glance, the Tollense Valley looks like a place where nothing has ever happened. A narrow ribbon of wetland in northeastern Germany, stretching along a sluggish river surrounded by farmland and willow trees. Quiet, forgettable. But 3,250 years ago, it was hell. The discovery began by accident. In the 1990s, a volunteer stumbled across a human arm bone protruding from the mud, pierced clean through by a flint arrowhead. At first, archaeologists assumed it was a one-off, a murder victim perhaps, a local grave. But upon closer inspection, this was only the first clue to something way bigger. A human upper arm bone with a flint arrowhead embedded clean through it, still firmly lodged. The clean penetration and healed bone around it suggests the man may have survived the injury briefly, only to die later, maybe in the same conflict. From there, they kept digging. Over the next 2 decades, researchers unearthed the remains of more than 200 individuals, along with hundreds of weapons, broken tools, smashed skulls, and severed limbs. Bronze spearheads, wooden clubs, arrow shafts still lodged in vertebrae, rib cages shattered, kneecaps crushed. This wasn't a burial site. There were no graves, no careful positioning, just corpses dumped or left where they fell, mixed with animal bones and flood debris. Many had never been recovered. No survivors had come back for them. Radiocarbon dating placed the battle around 1250 BCE, roughly the time of the Trojan War. But this was not Homeric poetry. This was prehistoric Germany long before the region had written language or cities. According to the dominant archaeological consensus of the 20th century, large-scale battles simply shouldn't have been possible here at that time. And yet, here they were. In a 2011 paper published in Antiquity, researchers, led by Thomas Terberger and Joachim Kruger, confirmed what the evidence was screaming. This was a battlefield. The earliest with proof of massed combat between organized groups, long before the armies of classical antiquity. That made it revolutionary. The traditional view of Bronze Age Europe portrayed scattered tribal communities, bound by kinship ties and small-scale subsistence economies. Warfare, when it occurred, was assumed to be limited, raids over livestock or land, not pitched battles involving hundreds of men. Tollense broke that model. Osteological studies of the skeletons showed that many of the dead were young adult males, between 20 and 30 years old, most in peak physical condition. Some bore signs of previous injuries, healed fractures and scars from earlier fights, implying that this was not their first battle. One individual had survived a previous stab to the face, another had healed from an older projectile wound. Strontium and oxygen isotope analyses conducted on their teeth and bones revealed something else. Many of these men weren't locals. They had grown up in distant regions, some likely over 500 kilometers away. In 2017, a study by Price et al. In Science Advances used these fingerprints to show that several individuals came from southern Germany or even the Carpathians. This was no village feud. It was a multi-regional conflict, an armed engagement involving warriors who had traveled long distances, suggesting planning, alliances, and supply lines. Someone had coordinated this. Someone had brought men together on foot or horseback, armed them, trained them, and sent them to kill. And someone else had done the same. What unfolded in the Tollense Valley wasn't a skirmish. It was slaughter. Over a stretch of nearly 2 kilometers along the riverbank, archaeologists found the remains of hundreds of individuals, tangled, overlapping, shattered. This wasn't a burial ground or a site of ritual execution. This was a battlefield, frozen in time. The weapons told the story as clearly as the bones. More than 50 flint arrowheads were recovered, many still embedded in human remains. Several had struck ribs or joints at angles that suggest close-range volleys, not distant harassment. Some arrows had snapped on impact, others had punched clean through limbs. Wooden clubs recovered remarkably intact in the anaerobic mud bore a shape optimized not for intimidation, but for fatal efficiency. A heavy ball on one end flattened to widen the blow, crude but effective. These weren't tools repurposed on desperation, they were weapons built for war. One of the most telling discoveries was a human skull, fractured on the left temple with such force that bone fragments were driven inward. The wound matched the curvature of a wooden club found nearby. The strike was targeted, deliberate and lethal. The angle and force suggest the man was struck head-on, possibly at close quarters with obvious intent to kill. Among the carnage, archaeologists uncovered splintered femurs, shattered pelvises, and crushed hands, likely from defensive wounds. Some corpses had wounds in the back, suggesting they were struck while fleeing or already wounded. Others had multiple projectiles lodged in them, the kind of overkill that only happens in chaos or fear. Crucially, many of the skeletons were deposited directly into the valley's ancient river channel. There were no burial pits, no arrangements. The dead had fallen into the water, or pushed there and then abandoned. No one came to bury them. No one lit funerary fires. The battle ended, and the bodies were left to rot. Forensic taphonomy showed that some of the corpses decomposed in standing water. Scavenger marks on the bones, gnawing by dogs or wolves, confirmed they had been exposed for days, even weeks. This wasn't an organized retreat or aftermath. It was a rout. But perhaps the most revealing pattern wasn't anatomical, but logistical. In total, over 12,000 human bone fragments had been recovered from the site so far. That represents only a fraction of the total battlefield. Given the known density of remains, researchers estimate that the conflict may have involved between 1,000 and 4,000 participants. That's not a raid. That's a Bronze Age army. And it's a number that forces a redefinition of what Bronze Age societies were capable of. To move and equip that many men across long distances requires command structures, food supplies, and a shared incentive, whether political, territorial, or ideological. None of that was supposed to exist in Northern Europe at the time. But the Tollense Valley doesn't care what archaeologists once believed. It preserves only what happened. According to the old archaeological textbooks, Bronze Age Europe was tribal, decentralized, and relatively peaceful. No cities, no empires, no armies in the formal sense. Certainly no organized warfare in the scale seen in Egypt, Anatolia, or Mesopotamia. Right? But the Tollense battlefield shattered that paradigm. The standard model of early European prehistory held that real warfare only emerged with the rise of state societies, those with hierarchical power, central leadership, taxation systems, and the ability to mobilize labor and violence at scale. In this view, Europe lagged behind the Near East by centuries, even millennia. But a battlefield with thousands of participants in 1250 BCE means that such assumptions were wrong. Because this kind of violence doesn't come from nowhere. It requires an awful lot to take place, like hierarchy, leadership, communication across distances. Someone had to recruit and transport these men, feed them, arm them, and give them orders. They had to meet in a prearranged location and execute a coordinated assault. The logistical complexity is incompatible with the notion of isolated chiefdoms and seasonal skirmishes. And we now know that the infrastructure was already there. Bronze artifacts recovered at Tollense, spearheads, pins, belt hooks, tools, point to a society that understood metallurgy, division of labor, and prestige economy. Some weapons were carefully cast and decorated, indicated specialist production. Others were more rudimentary, suggesting conscripts or lower status fighters. The variation implies not a random group of villagers, but a structured fighting force with ranks, roles, and potentially differing origins. A 2016 paper by Jensen and colleagues, published in Nature Communications, reinforced this interpretation. The battlefield showed signs of tactical engagement, narrow approaches, staggered attacks, and flanking maneuvers likely dictated by the terrain. The river crossing itself may have acted as a choke point, a deliberate place for an ambush. This wasn't an accidental clash. It was a planned confrontation, and its setting was chosen for strategic advantage. One of the more surprising finds was a preserved wooden fragment, part of a cart or wagon axle, along with bronze fittings. Carts meant transport. Transport meant planning. This was not a horde wandering into a fight, it was an expedition. And it wasn't local. Strontium isotope analysis proved that many of the combatants grew up far from the Tollense region, some hundreds of kilometers away. That implies either far-reaching alliances or mercenaries. Either way, we're not looking at a disorganized society. We're looking at one with logistical depth and mobility. And that throws a wrench into the neat timeline of European prehistory. Because if this kind of warfare was already happening in 1250 BCE, then social organization, trade, and political conflict in Bronze Age Europe were far more advanced than we thought. Not simple, not peripheral, and definitely not peaceful, but complex, centralized, and very much prepared for war. And Tollense was not a remote accident. It was a gear in a system we barely understood existed. A fragment of a wooden cart axle, along with bridle fittings and bronze rivets, was recovered from the site. These suggested organized transport, potentially a supply train, a military convoy, or the remains of a logistical operation that accompanied the army. But for decades, Bronze Age Europe was cast as a fringe region, outside the real centers of innovation. But when archaeologists began looking beyond elite burials and monumental architecture, they started noticing something else: infrastructure, trade, interdependence. A continent crisscrossed by networks, invisible to early scholars, yet vital to those who lived through them. The Tollense Valley battlefield lies along what was, in its time, a natural corridor, a riverine route linking the Baltic Sea to Central European river systems. And what moved along those routes wasn't just people. It was power, measured in tin, copper, amber, and salt. In the Bronze Age, metal wasn't just useful, it was sacred. The alloying of tin and copper to make bronze was a guarded process, and the materials needed for it came from distant places. Tin deposits were rare. The nearest sources were in Cornwall, Brittany, and parts of the Erzgebirge Mountains. Copper came from even farther afield, from the Alps, Slovakia, the Balkans. The Baltic coast, meanwhile, was famous for amber, a prized luxury as far as Mycenae and Egypt. This meant that Central Europe wasn't isolated. It was connected by necessity. Anyone who could control a stretch of land along these resource highways stood to profit. Tollense may have been one such choke point. A 2020 study by Terberger and colleagues in Prehistory Zeitschrift highlighted the concentration of non-local goods found at the site. Not just weaponry, but pens, belt hooks, and other ornaments consistent with long-distance exchange. Several of the bronze items matched typologies from Bohemia and southern Germany, suggesting that the combatants were either guarding, raiding, or ambushing a convoy of high-value material. Add to this the presence of wagons, bridle fittings, and remnants of organized transport, and the picture becomes clearer. Tollense wasn't a village, it was a corridor, and it was contested. We tend to think of economic complexity as requiring coins, scales, or contracts. But in a prestige economy, where value is based on symbolism and social status, objects like bronze pens or amber beads were just as critical. Their movement across long distances reflects a deeper order: agreements between groups, obligations repaid with metal, alliances forged in exchange. And where there's wealth, there's tension. The escalation from trade to violence was likely not coincidental. It was systemic. Control of this route meant control of flow, and as societies grew in size and ambition, so did their appetite for dominance. The men who died at Tollense may not have been conscripts in the modern sense, but they were agents in a machine, drawn into a conflict driven by metal, mobility, and ambition. They weren't just fighting each other. They were fighting for control of the invisible highways that underpinned an entire world. The men who fought and died in the Tollense Valley weren't farmers caught in the wrong place. They were warriors, by profession, by training, and by culture. Multiple skeletons showed signs of earlier trauma, healed blade wounds, facial fractures, bone regrowth from old spear thrusts. This wasn't their first battle. Some had survived serious injuries only to return to the field again, suggesting repeated combat experience over time. One particularly striking case was a man whose skull had previously been sliced open by a sharp-edged weapon, a wound that had healed long before his final battle. When he died at Tollense, it was from a new strike, this time to the ribs, likely fatal. He lived through one war, only to be taken by the next. These were not temporary militias. They were hardened fighters. Their weapons too were varied, but not random. Many carried bronze-tipped spears, wooden clubs, and composite bows. Some had bronze daggers or slashing swords, while others wielded simpler tools, flint knives or sharpened sticks hardened by fire. The diversity wasn't evidence of improvisation. It reflected a hierarchy. High-status warriors likely had access to expensive bronze gear, while others fought with what they could afford or were issued. This mirrors a pattern seen elsewhere in Bronze Age Europe, especially in elite graves like the Echtvet girl or the tumulus culture warriors of southern Germany, where personal ornament and weaponry were indicators of role and status. But perhaps the strongest indicator of a martial culture is what the battlefield lacked: civilians. Among the more than 12,000 human bone fragments recovered, there are virtually no women, no children, no elders. The demographic skew is overwhelming, nearly all young adult males in fighting condition. This was not a village caught off guard. This was a mobilized group assembled for combat. And it wasn't an isolated case. Across Europe, the Late Bronze Age shows a rising tide of militarization. Hilltop fortifications appear more frequently in the archaeological record. Settlements begin to cluster in defensible positions. Weapon hoards increase, sometimes deliberately buried, never retrieved. Large bronze swords caches in places like Nibra in the Thames suggest not just preparation, but stockpiling. And graves start to speak a different language. Bodies buried with swords across the Danube and Rhine regions, often alongside ornaments and imported goods, reveal a shift in identity. A sword was not just a tool, it was a symbol of who you were. Some anthropologists argue this marks the rise of a warrior elite, a class defined not by age or birthright, but by access to metal, alliances, and the ability to inflict violence. These men didn't just protect trade, they were trade. They moved between regions, tied together by oaths, spoils, and status. Being a warrior was essentially a way of life. Live by the sword, die by the sword. Tollense may have been the first place we found their bones, but it wasn't the first time they fought. It was just the first time the ground remembered. Tollense was a war without a witness. No chroniclers recorded the names of the fallen. No kings claimed credit. No monuments were raised to the victors. There were no hieroglyphs, no clay tablets, no bronze plaques hammered into stone. The silence wasn't symbolic. It was structural. Northern Europe in the 13th century BCE was still pre-literate. Unlike Egypt or the Hittite Empire, where conflicts like the Battle of Kadesh were carved into temple walls. The peoples of the Tollense Valley left no written record of their history. The only surviving documentation came not in words, but in wounds. And so for over 3,000 years, the story of this battle remained buried. First under waterlogged sediment, then under layers of assumption. It wasn't until the late 20th century that anyone began to suspect a battlefield even existed. And even then, the scale was unthinkable. Most archaeologists were trained to see Bronze Age Europe through the lens of tribalism, isolated hill forts, prestige graves, small-scale raids. The idea of large coordinated violence contradicted decades of scholarly inertia, but the evidence couldn't be ignored. Starting in the early 2000s, systematic excavations by the Landsamt für Kultur and Denkmalpflege Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and I'm sorry for the pronunciation of that one, alongside interdisciplinary teams of forensic scientists, paleopathologists and isotope analysis began assembling the picture bone by bone. What emerged was a pattern no one had anticipated, and few were prepared to accept. Even today, the site remains underanalyzed. The excavation has uncovered only a portion of the original battlefield, and thousands of bones still lie beneath peat and water. Every new season reveals more evidence, and with it more discomfort. Because Tollense didn't just rewrite a chapter, it calls into question the index. It asks, what else have we missed? How many other battles dissolved into marshland? How many bones were mistaken for burials or left unexamined in museum basements? How many prehistoric conflicts shaped the genetic, cultural, or political landscape, only to vanish for lack of ink? This is the paradox of prehistory. Its most violent chapters are the hardest to see. War doesn't fossilize. It bruises the ground, scatters artifacts, and moves on. Only when the mud grips tightly enough, when anaerobic bogs preserve what time tries to erase, can we see it all. And even then, we only see the shadows. We don't know why these men fought. We don't know who won. All we know is that something mattered enough for hundreds of men to die for it, but it didn't matter enough for anyone to remember through the centuries. The Tollense battlefield isn't just a window into the past, it's a fracture in the timeline. It forces us to reevaluate the tempo and texture of prehistoric Europe. Before this discovery, Bronze Age Northern Europe was treated as peripheral, undeveloped, a backdrop for cultures elsewhere. Mycenae, Babylon, Thebes, places with pyramids and scribes. But Tollense demonstrates that complex conflict was not limited to literate states. It could arise anywhere the right pressures converged: metal, mobility, ambition. This reshapes how we think about power before history. It suggests that political organization in Europe may have existed well before the written word, just invisible to traditional archaeology. Archaeologist Barry Molloy, writing in World Archaeology, argued that warfare in Bronze Age Europe wasn't an exception, it was the norm. Burial patterns, settlement fortifications, weapon hoards, and trauma patterns all point to societies built not just with violence in mind, but around it. Tollense gives this theory a battlefield, an actual site where those dynamics became real. It also blurs the distinction between state and tribe. If hundreds of warriors could be mobilized, supplied, and directed into coordinated battle, then those communities had administrative capability, whether we call it a state, a chiefdom, or something in between. The language may be academic. The reality was organizational. It changes how we read the artifacts too. A bronze sword is not just a tool of war. It's a signpost. It implies access to trade routes, metallurgic knowledge, and a social structure that values and possibly restricts violence. In this light, every buried dagger or pinned brooch becomes part of a political economy. A battlefield frozen in conflict becomes a map of power. And finally, it changes the story of how Europe evolved. Because if Tollense is not unique, if it's simply the first we've found, then it implies there are more. More valleys soaked in memory. More bogs hiding trauma. More truths about prehistoric Europe that remained submerged. Not because they never existed, but because we haven't looked. Tollense doesn't rewrite ancient history. It reveals that we never knew it. We don't know their names. No genealogies survived for the hundreds who fell in the Tollense Valley. No songs passed down their feet. No descendants carved markers where they died. For over 3 millennia, they were anonymous, discarded by time and overgrown with reeds, but their bodies remembered. Every wound in the bone is a sentence, every embedded arrowhead a punctuation mark, every broken hand a final reflex. Forensic archaeologists have translated those injuries into narrative. Men surrounded, ambushed, overwhelmed. Some shot in the back as they fled. Others felled by heavy clubs to the skull. Several fell into the river, their bones recovered by chance from riverbeds nearly 4 meters below the current surface. And they weren't all equal in death. Some bore signs of care. A few had been moved, perhaps by survivors trying to retrieve the fallen. Others were stripped, possibly looted. Bronze gear was rare among the remains, not because it wasn't there, but most probably because it was taken. Because as we mentioned earlier, these items were actually precious in their own way. The living left with what they could carry. The rest they left behind. But even in decay, their structure. Clusters of bones show where men fell together. Defensive wounds on forearms suggest a final stand. One pair of skeletons were locked in position, one missing both hands, the other with a spear still lodged in his hip. Whether it was mercy or vengeance, we'll never know. But it happened here, and it left an imprint. Modern techniques have brought them closer. CT scans, stable isotope analysis, 3D facial reconstructions. We now know what some of them looked like, where they came from, what they ate in their final days. In some cases, even what childhood climate they grew up in. Still, we don't know why they fought. There is no smoking tablet, no engraved cause. Was it territorial? Was it retaliation? Was it about power, prestige, or metal? We can speculate, but the bones don't tell us motives, only outcomes. What remains is not a monument to glory, but a ledger of loss. Over 200 dead in a single engagement, likely more than any other prehistoric battle yet uncovered in Europe. A death toll so high it resembles early modern warfare, not prehistory. And yet it happened here. Long before borders, before feudal lords, before written treaties. The men of Tollense were never supposed to be remembered, but their skeletons defied history's indifference. Their injuries refused to be erased. Now they stand, quietly, silently, at the center of a story they never got to tell. A ghost army pulled from the mud, demanding that we reconsider everything we thought we knew about Europe's past. The Bronze Age was never quiet. We imagined it as slow-moving, tribal leaders bartering cattle, scattered hill forts basking under cloudy skies, a continent on the edge of history, but not yet part of it. Tollense destroys that illusion. It reveals a world already networked by trade, by ambition, by violence. A world where alliances stretched across mountain ranges, where warriors traveled weeks to reach a battlefield, where some never returned. A world where political influence was measured not in lines on a map, but in bodies on the ground. The Bronze Age was transitional, yes, but not passive. It was a crucible of change. Technology, mobility, and conflict collided to form the foundation of the Iron Age societies that would come next. And while we know the names of later empires, Assyria, Rome, Athens, we forget that their precursors bled into the same soil. Tollense wasn't just a battle, it was a signal. A signal that Europe's story didn't begin with Julius Caesar or Herodotus. That strategy, hierarchy, and death on an industrial scale existed long before parchment. That even without writing, people left records, in bone, in bronze, in blood. And the past is always deeper than we think. Because this valley, for centuries dismissed as a patch of empty wetland, turned out to be one of the earliest preserved theaters of organized war in all of Europe. And it sat in silence for over 3,000 years, until we finally learned to listen. If this story made you rethink what prehistoric Europe was really like, don't let it end here. Like the video, share it with someone who still imagines the Bronze Age as quiet and tribal, and subscribe for more stories buried just below the surface. What do you think happened in the Tollense Valley? Were these men defending something, or trying to take it? Was this a local uprising, a failed invasion, a forgotten civil war? And how many other battles like this are still hidden in the mud, waiting for the river to rise just enough? Drop a comment. I want to know what you see in this silence. Thanks for watching. Till next time, keep listening to the echoes.